All right, picking up from the last video, we were talking about European capital markets and, in particular, banking. Remember, banks are the primary way through which European corporations get their funds, as opposed to stock markets being the primary way in the Anglo model. In Europe, you have more often universal banks. These are banks that perform not only traditional banking, but also things like risk sharing, stock sales, and merchant banking functions. Contrast this from the US. In the US, we've separated banking into kind of commercial banks and investment banks. And they do very different things. Commercial banks cater more to individual households and businesses, whereas investment banks cater to kind of the financial sector. An investment bank like Goldman Sachs, we mentioned before, might underwrite a stock issue for a major corporation. But Chase doesn't do that. Wells Fargo doesn't do that. They're representing everyday, ordinary people. So we've separated banking into investment banks and commercial banks. Whereas in Europe, you don't see as much of this separation. You see these universal banks that kind of do it all. And some famous examples are Germany's Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbank. You also see a lot of state public banks. In the US, government-owned banks are rare. We have the Fed, right? And we have the 12 regional branches of the Fed and various district branches. But the Fed is a banker's bank. They don't represent average, ordinary people, which means that for most of us, we deal with private, profit-motivated banks. In Europe, you're more likely to see these state-owned banks. These are often founded as nonprofits, and they're there to support that kind of region of the economy. They represent in Germany about half of all loans. So much more government involvement in banking at the lowest levels in these European markets. And that fits with the overarching role of government in the European model, right? We started this section by talking about how there's a larger place for government in the European model. There's advantages and disadvantages to having these kind of capital markets. The disadvantage is banks have a lot more influence, and you get the bank bureaucracy intertwined with the individual companies that they fund. The advantages, though, is banks have the ability to diversify risk. You're talking about banks having a lot of money, and they're able to take those funds and put them in a multitude of different companies. So they can spread out those risks, and they can also monitor the companies. The companies themselves are going to be accountable to the banks. So if they want to continue to get capital from those banks, they're going to need to impress the banks and make sure that they're not mismanaging the bank's funds. Banks are also traded on an exchange, so they're held accountable indirectly through market discipline. So if a bank makes a loan to a company that ends up being a bad company, then the bank itself is going to suffer lower stock values because investors are not going to want to buy into a bank that makes bad loans. So there's that level of market discipline, ultimately keeping the banks accountable. Let's talk about European labor markets. Europe has one of the most highly regulated labor markets in the world. We saw that in America, it's one of the most flexible labor markets in the world. So very different, kind of opposite sides of the spectrum. These labor markets involve often co-determination. This is where worker representatives are actually on the board of directors of companies. Very uncommon in the US. The board of directors is usually maybe executives or the CEO and then a bunch of outsiders that are voted in by the stockholders. But you really don't have worker representatives on US boards. But in Europe, it's much more common. The workers are co-determining the direction of the company. And this co-determination is not only on the board, but may go all the way down to the shop floor level, meaning that the lowest level workers may actually have representation in how the company runs. Industrial democracy, this is where management is required to consider the workers' interests to achieve a consensus. In the US, workers are an input in production. They're not usually consulted in the overarching management decisions or direction of the company. But in industrial democracy, the workers are. Enterprise constitutional law. This is a law that came about in Germany in 1972, and it kind of shows the extent to which the Europeans are attempting to integrate workers into decision making. It says that firms with over 5 employees must elect an employee works council that represents workers at the floor level. And this employee works council will influence things like wages, length of the workday, firings, and layoffs. So this is not a high standard. I mean, you're talking about firms with more than 5 workers have to have this works council to represent workers at the lowest, floor shop level. Another one is the codetermination law. This came a little later in 76, and this says for big companies, those with over 2,000 employees, the shareholders and workers must have equal representation on a supervisory board of directors that ultimately elects the executive board of directors. This is known as a 2-tier system. So think about it like this. In the US, shareholders are the ones that determine the board of directors that ultimately run the company. But here, the shareholders and the workers have a 50-50 representation on this supervisory board that will determine who the board of directors are. So in essence, the workers get to determine half of who's on that board. And then you have in 1994, for the European Union as a whole, you have this Works Council Directive. It says firms that have over 1,000 workers or over 150 workers in at least 2 EU nations, now these would be big companies, right? They must consult and inform. These are requirements obligating employees or employers to consult with employees about the decisions that could directly or indirectly affect their jobs and keep them informed about the financial health of the business. Amazing. The idea that you would have to consult employees and inform them of things that directly or indirectly affect their jobs is shockingly different from what we see in the US. It's very uncommon for workers to be consulted or informed as to the decisions of the business, even if it does affect them. Okay, so you'll notice here that there is a priority being placed on the workers, and that's part of this stakeholder managerial style of capitalism, very different than in the US. Continuing on, we have the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997. This capped the work week to 40 hours. It does allow 48 hours with overtime, 4 weeks of paid vacation, minimum daily rest of 11 consecutive hours per 24-hour period, etc. So you'll notice that the European Union as an entity is taking on the representation of labor. It's not just country specific like what we saw in Germany. This is now a larger goal of the system. EU members can offer more generous benefits, but these would be the minimum for each country. And just contrast this from the US. So we do have standards in the US. I mean, we have a 40-hour work week and then overtime over 40 hours. We don't have mandatory vacation, so that's quite a difference. 4 weeks a month of paid vacation would be optional in the US, and I think the norm is 2 weeks in the US. We do have some states with minimum daily rest. You can't bring somebody back in, 4 hours after their shift ended unless you pay them overtime. So there are limitations. But for the most part, it's just a greater representation for workers and an attempt to try to improve the quality of the work life for those laborers. However, there is a downside to this. Obviously, the benefits that go to workers come at the expense of the owners. And that's, again, that stakeholder versus shareholder perspective. The German example is a good one. Germany has some of the most extensive labor regulations in Europe. For example, unemployment insurance in Germany, 32 months, almost 3 years, an individual is not required to take a job if migration or a cut in pay would occur. Notice of termination, the employer must give 4 weeks to 7 months, depending upon how long the employee has served that company. Companies must inform the Employee Work Council, who supplies their opinion to the state employment office, who approves or disapproves a termination. In the event you want to get rid of an employee, you have hurdles that you must overcome. If process is not completed within 90 days, it starts over. Workers have a right to appeal in a time-consuming and complicated process. So what you're doing here is you're trying to create a comfort for the worker. We got that, right? Giving them notice. In the US, there really isn't a requirement that you give an employee notice. Generally speaking, you need to pay them if you terminate them, but you could hire somebody and then 2 hours later fire them if you need to. There is no works council or state employment office that has to enter into the decision making for termination. And so it's easier. It's easier to terminate an employee. What does that do? Well, it makes jobs more tenuous. It makes the worker in the US a little bit more uncertain about their future prospects when they get a job. But it also, on the upside, opens up more job opportunities. Companies are more likely to hire someone and take a risk on them if they know that they're going to be able to get rid of them if it doesn't work out. Whereas in some of these European countries, because of these job hurdles, companies are less likely to take a risk on someone. They might only want to hire people that are vetted, that have experience, that are proven in the marketplace, rather than take a risk on a young new employee that could turn out, bad, but yet cost them a lot in terms of having to deal with this termination process. Rationale for labor market inflexibility. The European labor markets generally believe that shorter work hours generate more jobs. So their perspective is, if you have people working less each week, then there'll be more hours available for other people. So instead of having the 60-hour work week among a smaller group of people, you have a 40 or a 30-hour work week among a greater amount of people. Culture that values greater leisure relative to work. European culture appears to be less labor-oriented and more leisure-oriented. Now, this varies by country. The most famous example would be France, which has become the world's iconic image of leisure, right? Taking pride in their time off. I mean, in France, it's not uncommon for people to spend 3-4 hours at a cafe and just relaxing and enjoying freedom, whereas in the US, we see much less emphasis on leisure. And then job protections may raise worker productivity, loyalty, and reduce turnover. The belief is that when people do get a job, because they have all these protections, they're more committed. They're going to be more productive. They feel like they're integrated, a part of the company and not just an input in production. So the morale improvement may improve all these other aspects. Let me go back to this culture real quick, because that's an important one, and I don't want it to be misunderstood. When we say there is a culture towards leisure, it doesn't mean that they're lazy. It actually means that they're emphasizing productivity in a different form. And that sometimes reveals itself in a higher happiness index. Some of these European countries, individuals do rate themselves as happier than in the countries that have less worker protections, right? Those countries that value work over leisure. It's a trade-off, and there's no answer. It's subjective. The issues with labor market inflexibility. Well, there's several. The first is regulations are most stringent for full-time hires. That means if you hire someone for that full-time work, you're going to be subject to a larger array of hurdles in terminating them than you would be if you hire them for part-time. The same thing in the US, by the way. We have employers that employ people over 32 hours a week, do a lot more for those employees than we do if they hire them for less than 32 hours a week. And that means that companies often gravitate towards part-time over full-time. This creates a two-tiered labor market where you have these full-time workers that get all these job protections, comfortable benefits, and are very happy with their jobs, right? But you get these part-time workers that are kind of piecing together a work week. Maybe they have 2 or 3 jobs that are part-time. They don't have these protections. And sometimes they even become independent contractors because they can't get a job. What we would call now in the US a gig economy. Well, the gig economy was much more common in Europe than in the US for years. Difficulty in terminating poor performing employees reduces opportunity for young and inexperienced workers and may perpetuate poor performance. You can take these rules so far that people that have the jobs, they get protections and they don't really work hard because they don't fear that loss of job. Labor inflexibility can be catastrophic for a company during recessions. When a company loses business, you're telling them they can't terminate their workers. but they've lost their revenue, they've lost their sales. So it's very difficult for a company to survive with that kind of inflexibility. And then finally, short labor. Companies will often reduce hours instead of laying people off, which means the work week goes down instead of the unemployment rate going up during a recession. All right, we'll pick up with the next bullet in the next video.